Yo, what's good, E7 fam? Pat here, back to talk about the September 29th balance adjustment preview. If you've never seen how I do balance adjustment previews here on this channel, what I do is after seeing the buff targets, I kind of jot down some notes and think about why the character wasn't successful and what would have, they would have needed in order for them to actually be better. So that way, when we actually look at their buffs and or potential reworks, we can kind of compare and contrast, so that way I can get a better picture and hopefully you can also get a better picture so that we can determine together whether or not this buff or rework was successful. If you do enjoy this style of content, please consider leaving me a like or a subscribe. Helps me out here a ton at this channel. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at the actual adjustment targets. We're going to be talking about Stresa, Red Ravi, Karon, Arya, Taeyu, Rwana, Blaze Dingo, Red Kawana, Hassel, and then 2 artifacts as well. Magic for Friends, which is Mercedes' exclusive artifact, as well as Unfading Memories, which is Dian's limited artifact, which is currently available on the banner as of the recording of this video. First up, let's talk about Stresa. For Stresa, I have actually nothing written in my notes, and that is because this character is already very good, and I couldn't actually think of something that I would want to give him as a buff that wouldn't just completely break the character. He is making a pretty good resurgence right now in World Arena, and that is largely due in part to the fact that Adventurer Raz and Hand Guy are very dominant. They are very tanky characters, and they are basically prime targets for his S3 Star Extinction. It's pretty much what he was designed to do, is to counter characters like that. On top of that, he is still the best hunt character in the game. He can one-shot literally all of the hunts, and he's the only one that you can make a 0% RNG run for all of those runs as well, at least as far as I'm aware of. So there wasn't really a whole heck of a lot I could think of that would make this character better without making him actually broken. So let's take a look at what he actually got. Both changes are to his S3 Star Extinction. The first one makes it so that the skill cannot trigger a counterattack. This is actually a pretty good quality of life change. Commonly, what would happen is you would use Star Extinction and kill somebody like Adventurer Raz, only to be countered by a character like, say, Rem or Bellion, and that would remove the invincibility from Stresa, which allowed your opponent to use like maybe an Apocalypse Ravi S3, for example, kill the Stresa, and then just undo all of your hard work. So there wasn't too many scenarios where you would actually get, blown out by using Star Extinction, but they did happen frequently enough that it was frustrating if you actually use the character. So I'm okay with this change. Anytime a skill gets cannot trigger a counterattack, that's pretty good for the most part, because it gives us another way to kind of counterplay some of the more obnoxious characters to play against in the entire game. A lot of these casino style characters, like your Rems, your Bellions, your Violets, things like that. So that is a good change, I think, overall for people who play Stresa in PvP. The other thing here is the penetration rate condition was alleviated. So what I assume that means is that we need less attack now in order to hit the maximum threshold here on Stresa. Right now, around 4,000 attack with 250 crit damage is going to kill most things with Stresa that you're going to be encountering, at least without an attack buff. And with an attack buff, it's going to kill everything except the absolute tankiest knights, for example, like a 33k HP Fallen Cecilia is probably not going to die to that. You might need a little bit more juice in the tank, but for the most part, that's pretty much where he is. We need to see the numbers on this one before I can kind of say if it's like really good or really bad. I'm assuming that they're going to lower it a little tiny bit, and what that's really going to do, I think, is allow newer and intermediate players that don't have the absolute best gear laying around, it's going to allow you guys to play Stresa without needing crazy high quality gear on him for him to be successful. You're still going to be able to get your like 240 or 250 speed that you want on him without feeling like you need to put all of your best attack gear on him so that he can do his job. That's where I think it's going to end up being. It could obviously be way more ridiculous. Like they could drastically lower the penetration rate, and then like that way you can play like Bruiser Stresa with like not much attack and he could kill everything just as he does now. I don't think they're going to do that. It is a possibility, but again, got to see the numbers. But I think for the most part, the penetration rate condition being alleviated means that it's just going to make him more accessible and more playable for a lot of players in this game. Because right now, like even I don't have an extra spare set of gear that I can throw on him that will allow him to actually do his job, because all of my good speed damage gear is just tied up in other characters that are higher priority picks for me. So even I would benefit from this, even if it was just like lowering the number to like 3,800 with 250 crit damage. So overall, good set of changes. Doesn't break the character, doesn't make it like any, more or less the same. It just fixes an edge case and hopefully makes him a lot more playable for most players in the game. Next up, we have Red Ravi. So the two things that I have written here for Red Ravi, the first one, we need to make it so that the S3 doesn't have such an insane ramp up time. The game has gotten significantly faster since the era where Ravi was very dominant. It was a very slow, methodical, grindy meta, and we are starting to come back towards that a little bit, because now tank and turn 2 is a bit better of a playstyle than it has been pretty much all year. Right now, I would say that turn 2 and cleave are kind of like even, I feel like, in terms of viability. I think cleave is a little bit better, but that's just because of, maybe recency bias with Commander Pavel. But for the most part, this is a pretty balanced meta right now. So yeah, but still, even with all the balance, it's still a little bit faster than when Ravi was like at her prime. So we need to make it so that the S3 doesn't have the insane ramp up time, so we can get value out of our Ravi, much, much faster. On top of that, we need desperately, this is so much a Ravi change, we need a powerful red bruiser in the meta right now that is not Hua-Young. Hua-Young is almost always banned for the most part, so there's very few checks to like the early pick Alencia that don't get you punished. If you're going to pick like a red DPS to try and counter Alencia, you open yourself up to a whole can of worms. There's so many ways to get countered. What we really need is a bulky, powerful red bruiser, and hopefully these changes can make Ravi that. So let's see what we got. Demon's Blood, which is our S2 passive, you now start with 40 Fighting Spirit. Great. That means already right away we are going to be able to use our S3 much faster than we were in the past. On top of that, we now get 15% effectiveness per stack instead of 10%, which is really going to help out that S3 Devil Drive. It's going to make it feel a lot more impactful because we're going to be getting essentially an extra 25% effectiveness on this move. So that's really, really nice. The other change here is to the S3 Devil Drive itself. We have lowered the damage on it, but we have increased the penetration rate by 50%. So I think that's a huge change. Defense penetration is very, very powerful. We talk about characters like Lionheart Sirmia, like Remnant Violet. 50% defense penetration is pretty much what makes those characters as good as they actually are. So having 50% defense penetration rate on the move is very, very strong. And if you've never seen Devil Drive in general, this move is pretty backbreaking. It is a stun on the entire enemy team, and if they actually do get stunned, they also get pushed back by 100% combat radius. That's like a 2-turn stun in a lot of cases. It's pretty debilitating. And this move already has very, very good damage as a 1.2x multiplier for an AoE. That's really, really strong for an AoE. Like 1x is considered good for an AoE, or like 0.9 is like average. This is 1.2, and it has no cooldown. So it's possible, based on how many times you get attacked, how much fighting spirit you actually have here, you might actually be able to back-to-back this if you get like a couple of counters here or there. So very, very strong set of changes for Ravi. Will it be enough to make her the meta red bruiser we desperately need? I think so, but again, I'm not 100% sure. I do think that these are very good changes. It does address one of her core issues, was that it took too long for her to actually ramp up. It's not like she wasn't seeing no play. She was definitely seeing a little bit of play, largely into characters like Angel of Light Angelica, because she could operate very well while being silenced. But for the most part, really wasn't as popular as she used to be. And hopefully these changes do bring her back, because again, we really desperately do need a good red bruiser right now. The last thing really quickly to talk about before moving on to the next character with Ravi is that we also got an exclusive equipment change. Instead of having a 35% to burn the target for 2 turns on her S1, it now has a 70% chance to make the enemy unable to be buffed, so unbuffable for 1 turn when using the S1. That's a really rare debuff, by the way. Only, I believe, Elfelt and Green Lilibet have the ability to be giving unbuffable on the S1 in this game. So that plus the 35% stun chance makes that her S1 very, very powerful, especially since she's commonly played on counter set. So when she counters people, giving them unbuffable and potentially like a stun is really, really strong. Um, this is probably, I feel like, going to be the EE that most people switch to with the change. Before it was, I believe, the extra stun chance on the S3 just to have it. This is probably going to be used more often, more impactful. You're going to see this more often than you would the extra 10% stun chance. It might not be like for everybody. You might want to actually stick with the stun chance on the S3. But for the most part, I do think that this is going to be the one that a lot of people start to gravitate towards because we're in a very buff heavy meta right now. Any chance at giving unbuffable, even if it's for one turn, is pretty impactful. You again see characters like Elfelt, who is obviously seeing a bit more play now because of Commander Pavel. The S1 unbuffable is still sometimes relevant in those games. It might be an edge case, but it does squeak out wins for people. It is still a very strong debuff, so I do expect people to at least experiment with this one and actually play it, at least for the first couple of weeks. Next up is Karon here. For Karon, I would have liked for him to be a bit better as a counter cleave unit. And on top of that, I really wish that he wouldn't just get completely blown out by like a blue Kisei or a stun of some kind. That would really be helpful to him because there's so many times you pick Karon and he gets completely CC'd before he even gets to take his first turn. And then he wastes his immortality and then he just dies. So he basically has no game impact because he gets hard countered super, super, super easily. So they have changed his S2 passive. They removed the buff triggers, his S1 being AoE. They have moved that component to his S1 Void Slash. When the skill is used, if it was not triggered by a dual attack and the caster has a buff, the skill changes into an attack that targets all enemies. This change attack does not trigger a dual attack. If you'll notice here, the change component used to be only on the caster's turn. That is not the case anymore, which means that now you can actually counter with an AoE Void Slash. And if you proc Dust Devil on it, which I believe is an extra attack, not a dual attack, then you could potentially wipe a team. So yes, this does make counter Karon a bit better as a counter cleave unit. That said, the other change here to Immortal Will, I don't think really addresses a whole heck of a lot. Gains immortality and increased evasion for one turn when the caster receives lethal damage and resets the skill cooldown of Apocalypse. Can only be activated once every 6 turns. So, what would commonly happen with cleave teams is they would put a bomb on you before you even got to your immortality with a character like, say, Arya, and then they would detonate it. You would go into an immortality, but you'd be stunned, and then it wouldn't even matter that you have this evasion buff because you're at 1 HP, and then you're dead. Or Blue Kisei uses her S3, and then she, basically puts you at 1 HP. You proc Immortal Will, but then the Kisei triggers and removes all of those buffs. Doesn't really change anything. So there are some edge cases I feel like where Immortal will be better with this evasion buff. Like it's better than nothing, right? But it doesn't fix the most common issues that Karon has. Like he's still going to get destroyed by a lot of these scenarios that he's already getting destroyed by, like by aggressive or cleave players. They're already stunning him or giving him unbuffable long before he even gets to Immortal Will. So it would have been great if instead it said grants, when he goes to 1 HP after receiving lethal damage, cleanse all debuffs, then give him immortality and increased evasion. That would have been significantly better because you still have the counterplay from characters like your red Querix or blue Kiseis, but it still gives him a bit more play against these more commonly used cleave strategies. So that would have been really, really nice, I think, on Immortal Will. Overall, better counter cleave character. I don't think he is going to be as played, or I should say more, like as played as you'd like him to be. He is definitely going to see more play, I feel like, with these changes, but it's just, again, not as much as you would have liked it to be, right? Like, just imagine if, again, he had that cleanse on Immortal Will before getting immortality and evasion. That would have been significantly better, I feel like, overall. Can't complain too much, though. He used to be one of my most played counter cleave units. Maybe I'll actually, gear him up again and start using him with the change, because now with that change to Void Slash, you only really need like one counter and a Dust Devil to really just win against cleave teams. Whereas in the past, like you needed to counter maybe 3 or 4 times to actually secure the W with him. So maybe again, even though he still got those very easy weaknesses, at least now when he actually gets a counter, there's a high chance you'll just win the game outright. Next up is Arya here. The only thing I have written for Arya is that she needs to be less stat hungry as a character overall. She just needs too many stats to be good. You need high defense. You need very high HP. You need pretty good speed. You need high effect resistance so that you don't actually just get stripped and you can actually keep up the counter lock that you've got going on with her. Basically, you're only picking her really late into a composition when all the enemies have no way to really get to your stealth characters when activating the Umbral Hour. So yeah, we really needed something that made it so that it was easier to gear the character because she's just too gear demanding, in my opinion, for most players to actually take advantage of her. So let's see what she got. Shadow Call. Now, when it is not her turn, it makes so that the hit chance is increased from 50% to 70%. That's obviously going to be a pretty good change. It doesn't really address too many of the issues, but basically once you've established the Umbral Hour lock where your opponents all have to funnel into Arya, you're going to make it so that it is much more difficult for them to actually kill Arya because 2/3 of the time now they're going to be blind instead of just the coin flip of 50-50. We've also increased the damage on Shadow Call as well. Obviously, never going to say no to increased damage. And depending on the multipliers overall, once we see them, could basically make her a little bit less stat hungry. Maybe we don't need as much defense because they've drastically changed the multipliers. Maybe you get comparable damage now at a lower threshold, maybe say 1800 defense as opposed to 2000 where most people are playing her right now. That's really, really good. Again, we have to wait and see. They've also changed it so that the S2 passive here was changed. They've removed the critical hit damage component of Guide of Darkness, which is the exact opposite of what we want. We want to have more stats baked into the kit. I was hoping that we would get effect resistance naturally on the character's kit, like maybe 30%, for example, for free on Guide of Darkness. That would go a super long way in gearing this character, in whether that's going to be speed set or lifesteal set. But again, they've removed this component. However, they have increased the damage on Dark Shadow Phantom. Again, have to see the numbers, but considering we lost 50% critical hit damage potentially, I would think that this would be a pretty sizable damage increase overall. Again, not really sure because there wasn't really a way, looking at the data that we have, to determine how much damage we were actually getting based on the HP threshold. It's not like Bloodblade Karon where we knew at 75%, 50%, and 25% were the breakpoints for when we would get the bonus damage on BBK. We didn't really know that on Arya, so for all I know, like you got 50% at like 5% health, which was never going to happen anyway. So scrapping this in favor of increased damage is nice. It is probably going to be better overall for the character. I just wish that we, again, got more free stats baked into the S2 here, Guide of Darkness, than what we actually got. Again, maybe if they just double the damage or like give it like a 50% damage increase, that's probably going to be enough for me to feel pretty happy about it. And then lastly, we have a change to the Umbral Hour. It makes it so that the barriers are larger on the Umbral Hour. That is a double-edged sword because when you're picking Arya, there's a high chance that your opponent was never breaking the barriers anyway. So it didn't matter how big the barriers actually were. And then now, obviously, we have a character like Desert Jewel Basar, who's still seeing more and more play pretty much every day. I start to see an uptick in him all the time. He basically now has even more leverage against you with barrier inversion with the changes to the Umbral Hour. Overall, it's mostly going to be a nice change because a character like Lionheart Sirmia or Landy might have a more difficult time exposing the team in those edge cases where like Arya's picked and one of those characters still makes it actually through. I think that's like the only real thing that we get here out of this change to the Umbral Hour. I think the meat and potatoes of everything is basically the damage increase on the S1 and the S2. And again, we're going to have to see how that is. Not the buff I was expecting. It's definitely a better character as a result of the buffs, but I don't think it's enough to really help her see more play outside of, you know, those couple of streamers that you might see that pick her because they actually have the gear to make her work. She's, again, still just too difficult, I feel like, to gear for most of the players in this game, at least to do her job very, very well. Next up here, we're going to talk about Taeyu. Taeyu really needs a change to his S2, or at least his artifact. He really needs that combat readiness push to really kind of like get him out ahead of the opposing team when they use a non-attack skill. he just doesn't actually get a turn to punish people when they use non-attack skills. Politis basically zips herself to the front and uses a pretty devastating S2 when you actually use a non-attack skill. Same thing with Celine. Very punishing S2. And then also the combat readiness from her artifact Storm Sword. And, it'll probably be her turn, and then she'll get off a pretty powerful single target nuke as well. So these characters punish non-attack skills very, very harshly. Taeyu's S1 does obscene damage once he's enraged because you use a non-attack skill. The problem is that he doesn't really ever get to his actual turn. And it's not like we needed a whole heck of a lot here on the S2 or the artifact, because the character has 115 base speed, which is higher than both Celine as well as Politis. So even a 15% CR push added to the S2 would have gone a very long way. Yes, you could have just reworked the artifact if you didn't want it to stack, right? Just give it something else entirely. But for the most part, that's what he's really missing. He just doesn't punish non-attack skills anywhere near as hard as Politis or Celine does. So until he actually can reliably get a first turn in order to punish the enemy, I don't think there's anything you can really do to save him. So let's take a look at what he actually got. They changed the S3 here, Tornado Sweep, and now instead of dispelling 2 buffs from all enemies, it now is a full strip on all enemies, and it increases the skill cooldowns of the target with the highest attack by 1 turn twice. Then, on top of giving Taeyu an attack buff, it now gives him a speed buff for 2 turns, and as long as he is enraged, it basically gives him ignores effect resistance. So instead of being a full strip when he's enraged, it is now ignoring ER. That makes Tornado Sweep a very, very strong S3, right? Basar obviously has been a traditionally very, very strong way to get rid of a lot of buffs, because he would ignore effect resistance on the soul burn, and it was a full strip as well. Basar really doesn't see a whole heck of a lot of play anymore. There are definitely a lot of full AoE dispels as well. Those characters aren't really seeing a whole heck of a lot of play. This B is, again, though, still a very powerful skill. I don't want to make it sound like it's not nothing, right? If Taeyu actually had the combat readiness push that we talked about, then yes, this character would be very, very good, because the S1 now one-shots even Apocalypse Ravi's when he's enraged, and this thing, again, being a full strip that ignores effect resistance, that gives him a speed buff and an attack buff, and then also resets cooldowns. Absolutely loaded skill. Still doesn't fix the core issue of the character, which is that he cannot get to his first turns in the matchups that actually matter. So it doesn't matter how good you make Tornado Sweep, doesn't matter how good you make the Enraged S1. Until he can actually get to his very first turn safely, the character's probably not going to be seeing too much play, at least in my opinion. If I'm wrong, let me know down in the comments below. You can roast me in a couple of weeks when this is proven to be wrong. But for right now, I really just don't see on paper how this helps Taeyu at all. If anything, this just means now when they implement the change he's needed all along, he's probably going to be absolutely insane. Next up, we have Rwana, and just like with Stresa, I wrote nothing. This is one of the best PvP pocket picks in the entire game. She is the best blue expedition tank in the game. She is very strong in a lot of PvE content with things like the Hellraid Queen and so on and so forth. Character is just very strong when she's strong. One of the better characters I feel like players can actually have access to if they don't have her. Obviously, if you have not decided which character to take for the Azeran Foundation 4th anniversary, I do have a video on that, and Rwana is one of my highest recommendations. So there's really not a whole heck of a lot that you can really do to make this character better without being super OP. So let's take a look at what they gave her. Noble Rekos here now gives a barrier, and the barrier strength increases proportional to Rwana's max health. Honestly, pretty good change. Doesn't really increase our use cases overall. If anything, it just helps out newer players that are struggling with Expedition, or again, the aforementioned Hellraid stuff. So that's a pretty good change, and obviously it does help her a little bit as well in PvP. So this is pretty much like a perfect change when you think about it, because the character already was giving barriers anyway. So if somebody was playing Operator Secret or your DJ Basar into you anyway, there was only a matter of time before they were going to get to you. It's not like, again, it introduces this, it opens you up a ton to barrier hate you were already pretty much exposed to that same level of barrier hate. If anything, it just, again, provides a little bit more survivability for your team in the situations where you are playing Rwana, especially, again, in PvE. So good change overall. Next up, our Moonlight 4-star that we're going to be talking about here is Blaze Dingo. I'll be real with you guys. Blaze Dingo is a character I commonly ban if I ever run into him in PvP because I am traumatized from when I was a new player because he literally just kills like my entire team. It feels like in one hit if he actually gets to his turn. So if anybody that is like a mad lad out there actually picks Blaze Dingo, it already puts the fear of God into me basically. So I don't know, again, a whole heck of a lot about this character. I think if I was going to pick something, maybe reduce his burden of stats so that he can be faster, do more damage, or have some kind of better survivability. That's at least what my thoughts were. Taking a look at what he got, we made it so that the S2 Divine Punishment now has a 75% chance to defense break the entire enemy team for 2 turns. This move, by the way, also has a follow-up component to it with the S1, which means it's probably just going to outright one-shot anything that actually lives with Divine Punishment. You're basically going to go in, dunk the enemy team. If something still lives, whatever you originally targeted, if it's still alive and its defense broken, that follow-up S1 is pretty much going to kill it no matter what. So I think it just really doubles down and helps him with the really powerful, burst damage that he actually has in the kit. I guess it helps him kind of do his job a bit better. It lets him kill tankier characters. We also are in a meta now where generally characters are much tankier than they used to be like a year or 2 years ago. So I guess overall this is a pretty good change to him. It does help kind of reinforce the role. The problem is that I don't actually think he's still any more playable than he was with these changes. Like, I still think that it's a bit too hard maybe to set him up, or it might be too difficult for him to get to his first turn. Like, he is very fast for a Soul Weaver, but I just don't know how reliably you can actually set this character up. I do know that now, though, if he actually does get to his first turn, and you're unable to strip that invincibility and like the gab that he can sometimes give himself, that, yeah, you're probably going to die. You're probably in for a world of hurt. So, again, good change. Is it the change you needed? I'm unsure. You guys will have to let me know down in the comments below. Next up is Red Kawana. For her, I think what she really needs is some kind of a rework. She also needs to basically make it so that she's not restricted to an all-fire team. And the benefits that she was getting in the first place for being an all-fire team aren't really that amazing in the first place. So, yeah, this character definitely needs a lot of love. So, the changes. S2 here, casual introduction, now no longer needs an all-fire team in order to give a skill nullifier to all allies. Instead, it just gives a skill nullifier to the fire characters that are on your team. This could be a pretty good change, I think, for Ancient Inheritance, for example. But for the most part, I think just giving a skill nullifier to 1 or 2 characters on your team doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot to inspire confidence on this move. The best part of the character still is this move because it is an attack buff for all allies for 2 turns. Attack buff is the best buff, I think, in the game in most game modes. So that is a very, very good move overall to begin with. It's just that this bonus for playing fire elemental allies is not good enough in my opinion. So the change, almost worthless for the most part. Like, you're just going to get a skill nullifier on herself and like maybe one other person on your team for the most part. The second one here, Rough Welcome, that's our S3. Instead of having when all allies are a fire element on your team, you get a 20% combat readiness increase to all allies. It's now a combat readiness increase always of 20% to fire element allies. Yeah, that's still not like a super great buff overall, right? Because a lot of S1s in this game are giving like 15 to 20 combat readiness or even more at this point. So your S1 is essentially dispelling 2 buffs from 1 target as well as being a stun and then a minor CR push to yourself and maybe 1 other ally. So yeah, I don't really think that this changes a whole heck of a lot. Again, could be good in like Ancient Inheritance. I know that Kawazu and Kawana have seen some success there. So if you play those characters in Ancient Inheritance to begin with, then this is just straight upside for you. But I don't think this is enough to really help this character break into any new territories, break any molds, break into PvP, any of those things. I don't think it's enough. It's a buff character is definitely better for it, but it's not strong enough of a buff for me to feel confident in the ability of this character to, again, basically break into new territory, break new ground. Next up, let's talk about Hassel, who is a very popular character, and I already thought was a very, very strong 3-star. Just like with every 3-star in this video, I think the only thing that Hassel needs is a specialty change. The character was already very, very good. She just needed a specialty change so that she has stats akin to a 5-star. The stats are the biggest problem with 3-stars. There are a lot of 3-stars in this game that have very, very good kits, but the stats are just so low compared to other characters that they just don't make an impact. So we are usually banking on specialty changes to make characters viable, because then they will have the stats necessary to actually compete. The only 3-star that really makes a dent in PvP at this point is Mirza, because of her ridiculous damage multipliers, as well as the dodge chains, and then the speed imprint on the character as well. So let's take a look real quick and see what Hassel actually ended up getting, because aside from a specialty change, everything is just straight upside. She's not going to really see much play, I think, until she gets it. But again, all of these changes are just straight upside. So they have made it so that the 500 fixed damage on her S1 Swift Cut can now trigger off of counter attacks. It doesn't have to be her turn in order to get that fixed damage. Very good for this character because she is a knight, which means you can use Elbrus Ritual Sword on her, which means you're going to have basically pseudo true damage S1s on this character every time she triggers Elbrus Ritual Sword. The healing component also of this S1 was decreased, probably because you were going to probably now play her on Elbrus Ritual Sword and get more value out of it. It's a fine change. Even if they nerf it by 30%, the move is still very, very strong with this change, so that way it can actually be used on your off turns with things like Counter Set and Elbrus Ritual Sword. The S2 here, Blade of Vengeance, was changed. When an ally suffers a counterattack, it decreases that damage by 25%. Really strong. That's very akin to Phyllis. Phyllis has these damage reductions on things like dual attacks, for example. So these are always welcome. It kind of distinguishes yourself as it carves out a niche for you as a knight. Oh, Hassel is the character I want to be picking when my opponent has a very counter-heavy team. That's when I want to be picking Hassel. I want to take her into Guild War fights where there's a lot of counterattacks, for example. So that is a very, very good change. Obviously, does not stack with other damage passives. To offset this, the combat readiness here increase of 30% when somebody triggers a counterattack is reduced by 5% to 25%. Additionally, now, the true damage of S1, it used to be 1,000 every time somebody triggers a counterattack. Now it is on her S3 as well, and it still stacks up to 4 times. So essentially, you now are going to be getting 4,500 true damage when you proc Elbrus Ritual Sword late into the game with Hassel, in addition to the move's base damage. That's really powerful. That can basically 2-tap a lot of these characters that say Spirit Eye Celine, or a character like Roy Mustang. Those characters are in serious trouble against passives like this one. Even Sage Vivian is also in trouble with a passive like this one. So I feel pretty good about this character whenever she gets a specialty change with this change to Blade of Vengeance. Really, really strong passive now with these changes. So Punishing Strike, that is her S3, had a couple of changes as well. It lost the increased speed component of it. The damage was decreased on it. And then it also got a +1 turn cooldown. In exchange, it has that 500 fixed damage, and again now is stacked by the S2 to it. So that's really, really good, because you're basically going to get at max stacks a 4,500 true damage AoE plus whatever else attack. That's really strong. That can kill a lot of squishies for sure. It can punch through a lot of defenses. So I really do like that. Still has the defense on all allies, and instead of getting the speed buff, you now get a barrier for 3 turns. We don't know how big it is. We'll have to see the multiplier. Additionally, after she suffers a counter attack, it decreases this skill cooldown by 1 turn. So basically, they made it so that even though the cooldown is increased on this, you're going to be using it more often overall because you're going to be picking Hassel into counterattack units, so it is going to get this cooldown lowered basically whenever you get those counters. So the character is now a very cohesive character, right? Like, we know exactly what this character is. She is a bruiser that is leveraging Elber's ritual sword to kind of destroy compositions that are heavily relying on counterattacks. She has a very powerful kit in a very specific scenario. And I like it when they make characters like this. So Hassel looks amazing on paper right now. It's just right now we just don't have the stats. So whenever we get that specialty change, just know, just like with the upcoming ROL specialty change, it doesn't really matter what ROL gets as the specialty change in terms of runes. As long as she's got stats, like they don't shaft her on the stats with the runes, the character, I promise you, will be a meta player. I feel the very same way now about Hassel with these changes. Once she gets a specialty change, this character is very, very, very strong, regardless of whatever else they give her. As long as she's got stats, character is going to be great. To round out the video, let's talk about the 2 artifacts here. The first one of which is going to be Magic for Friends. Again, that is Mercedes exclusive artifact. I have written here that we need to make it so that if we're going to buff Magic for Friends at all, that the damage reduction here that is suffered is more in line with other critical hit damage reduction effects. They're traditionally always 30%. For some reason, Magic for Friends is 25%. And then other than that, it'd be cool if, for some reason here, Magic for Friends could come back whenever the character died, because that's one of the most frustrating things, is because when the character would die and she proc Magic for Friends, you don't actually get it on the revive, which basically takes all of the threat out of the actual character. So lo and behold, that's exactly what we got when we take a look at what we got on this artifact. Almost every single critical hit damage reduction effect in this game is 30%. It was so weird that Magic for Friends for some reason was 25%. So I have no idea why that wasn't the case in the first place. And apparently they even said that if Mercedes would die and she would proc Magic for Friends, that was a bug. It was an unintended bug, right? It says it's right here. Moreover, to fix the issue where Dimensional Rupture from Magic for Friends is activated before dying and the actual skill effect is not used, only to increase its cooldown, will no longer activate upon death. So it was a bug fix, apparently. So that's really good, because that's the worst thing in the world. I love playing my Mercedes. So when she dies and you see the pink text Magic for Friends pop up, you're like, oh man, now I know I'm getting no value out of this character when she revives. So that is a very, very good change. As a Mercedes player, very, very happy with this. And again, it's exactly what I expected them to give for this artifact. Lastly, let's talk about Unfading Memories, which is one of the artifacts I voted for in that poll a couple months ago about artifacts that desperately needed a buff. Here it is. We finally got a change to Unfading Memories. If I could have anything on this thing, I would have wanted a huge increase to the healing. And it also needed to do something a little bit extra, because right now Soul Weaver artifacts are like hella pushed. Guardian Ice Crystals is insane because it gives effect resistance, as well as that Water's Origin style passive. Water's Origin obviously still also very, very strong. And then you have things like Rod of Amaryllis, Magaraha's Tome, even like Idol's Cheer, all very powerful artifacts. So it's tough for a Soul Weaver artifact to really break into actually seeing playability. So let's take a look at what we got here on Unfading Memories. It now increases the effect resistance of the person wearing it by 25%. That's huge, by the way, because traditionally it is 15 to 20% on most Soul Weaver artifacts. You don't normally get 25%. That is quite a lot. And a lot of people who play DN are playing her around like 150 ER, and this will bump them up to 175. For me personally, this will put me around closer to 220 to 225 ER with the way I play my DN. So that's a pretty enticing offer, because that kind of puts me out of range of characters like Pera or like Angel of Light Angelica, for example. So that is a pretty huge change in my opinion. The heal strength was also increased. Instead of being 4 to 8% when using a non-attack skill, it's now 5 to 10%. So that's about 7.5% at plus 15. That is almost tempting enough. I think it might be a little bit too low still. I think maybe if it was like, I don't know, maybe like 6 to 12, then maybe I feel a little bit better about it. But as it is right now, I'm unsure. I'm probably going to play it because I can get Unfading Memories to like plus 21. Whereas in my entire career of Epic 7, I have never pulled Rod of Amaryllis. I literally only have one that I bought from the powder shop. So for me, it's going to be like roughly like 9% healing to the whole team versus like 16% healing to one person on Rod of Amaryllis. That plus the effect resistance makes it worth it to me. But for those of you out there who have like a plus 30 Rod of Amaryllis on your DN, which is I believe 20% healing, I don't know if I would give that up, that level. It might even be more. It might be like 24%. I don't even think I would give up that level of healing for this. This is a very difficult one to evaluate because I think it depends on the player and their resources available to them. I think, again, plus 30 Rod, probably not going to want to take this, even if you could get this at plus 30. But for those of us who have like only a 15 Rod or like an 18 Rod, I feel like a couple of copies of Unfading Memories, like a 21 or like an 18 to 21 Unfading Memories, kind of beats out a 15 to 21 Rod of Amaryllis. So again, hard to evaluate. It's close-ish, right? I think Rod probably still edges it out, but it wouldn't surprise me if everybody switched over to Unfading Memories just because of the effect resistance. Good change overall. Went from being something that I thought was completely unplayable to something now that is very much a contender for a slot for DN especially. So yeah, this is a very good change in my opinion. And then lastly here, just to point this out if you didn't see, the next balance adjustment here is going to be 4 weeks from now as opposed to 8 weeks from now. And then the exclusive equipments that we should have been getting 4 weeks from now will be now coming out 8 weeks from now. So you will be seeing me doing another one of these in the very, very near future. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If I missed anything, as always, let me know down in the comments below. Always love reading your feedback on these style of videos because, again, this is like, if anything, this is the one type of video where I'm bound to make a misprediction or get something wrong. So again, would love to hear from you all. As always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I will catch you all either later today or tomorrow when I drop the guide for Adventurer Roz. Later now.